Hello and welcome to The View. Thank you for joining us. I'm Barbara Serra. The View is a regular panel-based discussion program from the Radicalisation Awareness Network, exploring the challenges that we face in preventing and countering violent extremism. Our panel for this program is a stellar cast of EU member state representatives and practitioners who will share their latest insights. Well, in this episode, we're going to look at the ways in which young people have been targeted by radicalisers during the COVID lockdown. They've had a very captive audience, with millions of young people forced indoors and spending more and more time in front of their screens. The last few weeks have seen some painful reminders that terrorism is still very much with us. There have been horrific attacks in the French city of Nice and the Austrian capital, Vienna. So what do these incidents tell us about how terrorism and extremism are evolving? And what do we make of reports that children as young as 12 have been targeted by the extreme right during lockdown? There's a lot of anger and resentment out there. Once we emerge from COVID, what will be the extent of extreme right activity that is revealed? Well, to try to find some answers, I'm joined by a hugely talented panel of experts from across Europe. Silvia Ramos is based at the Counter-Terrorism Unit of the Judicial Police in Portugal. She has witnessed the growth of the extreme right in that country in recent years. Julienne Cabanangi is a Paris-based community activist who works in some very challenging communities. She's run some amazing projects in the suburbs of the French capital. Fabienne Wickman works with Exit Germany, de-radicalizing people who've become involved in neo-Nazi and white supremacist activity. And Annelie Portman, who represents the city of Helsinki, has been involved in researching and advising on that country's counter-radicalization approach. Well, before we begin the discussion, first let's hear from Paul van Tighelt, who is the director of the Coordination Unit for Threat Assessment in the Belgian government. Earlier, I asked him about his concerns on what extremists have been up to during the COVID lockdown.
What we see in the digital space is we see that people are becoming more venomous, more violent, more aggressive, and we should be aware of that. We see that ideologies are mixing, a patchwork of different ideologies. And what we certainly see is we always need a scapegoat, and the scapegoat for this crisis could be authority, government.
Well, let's go straight now to Julienne Cabanangi, community activist speaking to us from Paris. Julienne, we heard there things are becoming more venomous, more violent. What have you found in your experience since the beginning of the COVID pandemic?
We saw that there is more and more young people who are on internet and following some extremist page on Facebook, on Twitter, or on Instagram. And our big problem right now is how, as a community activist, we can find solution to fight them. So we start a program with Google a few weeks ago to fight against fake news, because fake news was one of the big event happening on internet.
Okay, Julienne, thank you for that for now. Silvia Ramos speaking to us from Portugal. Is that a similar situation that you found in Portugal, an increase in racism, Islamophobia, and crucially a lack of trust as well?
Yes, we think that during the general restrictions context, there was an increase on the online activity because people are spending more time at home. And we have not only the already extremists doing that, but also other people and sympathizers that totally agree.
Fabienne Wickman speaking to us from Germany, from Exit Germany. Now, you have been fighting against the extreme right for a long time in Germany. How have you noticed that they have managed to use, I guess, the sort of issues of trust and fear around COVID and also the anti-vaccine movements? How have the two linked up?
I think we have a situation here in Germany that there's a wider protest, and we see that there are some far-right but also violent far-right extremist groups try to use this protest for their own narratives. So they go to these demonstrations, they go into the internet spreading fake news and conspiracy narratives and all that stuff. just to bring that online protest down to the streets. And that is what we see right now. There are a lot of riots and protests there.
And how do you think specifically the lockdown, the fact that so many young people have more or less been kept at home and spent a lot of that time on the screens, has that had a massive impact on its spread?
Yes, on the one hand, we have only the medium internet for information, for news and all that stuff. And there's a great, people are insecure, people feel unsafe, people are, there's not clear what happened next. So out of this situation, they are searching for solutions, they're searching for something, hope. And maybe the internet and some conspiracy theories and also people who are radicalizing, they promote these kind of stuff. And that's the problem, and that's the lack of trust they built in front of their government and their democracy.
Yeah, of course. I mean, COVID has been a huge test for governments everywhere in the world. Well, let's go to Sweden now, because a little earlier I spoke to Magnus Ranstrup from the Swedish Defence University and asked how he thought that COVID lockdown conditions had impacted the way that terrorists and violent extremists operate.
We're not even in the game. We are playing catch up on this because we are distracted and we are dealing with the COVID crisis. And therefore, this is an open space for them to exploit, particularly young people who are isolated. And therefore, I think we need to be perhaps more on the offensive.
Okay, back to our panel for their views. Let's go to Anneli Portman speaking to us from Finland. So I guess the wide question to you of how you think that lockdown and COVID have impacted the radicalization, and also if you think that there's a real economic dimension to it, that because of the economic impact that COVID has had, not just keeping people at home, but that's also made the situation worse.
I think it's natural that economy has a great impact on the kind of work we do. But I think that this time, the COVID has hit particularly hard those who already were vulnerable to be disadvantaged. And so one thing we are seeing that it's not just the time spent in front of a screen, but that it's the time spent away from education or away from influences that would broaden the picture. And the worst thing about this is that there is no guarantee that as societies come out of COVID, that there would be enough money to make sure the gap between the haves and the have-nots is effectively diminished.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're still very much in the middle of the COVID pandemic. No one really knows when and how it will end. Can I ask for a specific example, though, from you, Anneli Portman? In Finland specifically, what kind of things have you seen that you think are particular to that country?
I think that typically Finland reacts to anything with education. We always educate. So on the positive side, we have seen a massive moving towards digital education and a massive move to try to tackle fake news by teaching both adults and youngsters how to recognize fake news. Unfortunately, at the same time, we've seen a huge surge in QAnon type of activities and people believing their narratives.
Okay, well, Anneli Portman, as you say, education obviously a key tool in trying to defeat this. So that's the Finnish solution or part of it. Because of that, let's get one final insight from Tarja Mankinen from the Finnish Ministry of the Interior. Earlier, I asked her if governments are ready for the challenges ahead.
Governments and practitioners are never doing enough. It's the fact that we always have to do more and more. And this phenomenon is evolving all the time. So we need new measures and new strategies and new practical things, practical measures. I think the most difficult is that in many countries, we have strategies and action plans, but do we have enough concrete measures on a grassroots level?
Well, let's get final thoughts on that from our panelists. So, Julienne Cabanangi, coming back to you, new practical, concrete measures. What do you think those could be where you work, for example, in some of the banlieues in France?
So we use sport because sport is the most easier way to bring young people together, girls and boys, and talk about French Republic, talk about the threat to the Republic, and try to create a new hearable speech about a common identity.
If we can go now to Silvia Ramos, do you think prevention strategies that you're using right now are actually still working? And if not, how important is it to have concrete measures and to reach out to community groups?
We believe that not only we have to be active also in the prevention work and dealing with the community actors. And it's the best way to reach the young people and vulnerable people.
Fabian Wickman speaking to us from Germany. Fabian, what's interesting is that, of course, the extreme right always has a deep nationalist stroke nativist root to it. So specifically in the kind of work that you have done, what have you found works and what strategies would you like to see put in place when the COVID lockdown lifts, or, whenever, or even now, that you think would be effective in countering this?
So right now is what we need, where something like new developings in online street work, new developings in online outreach. But the problem is that there's no infrastructure right now. So most of the NGOs do their job really good, and they try to solve the problems right now, also connected to COVID, but they didn't have the resources to do this right now. So there's no communication structure to do this right now.
Okay. Anneli Portman, final point to you. You mentioned a little earlier in the discussion how education is seen as key in Finland and often a part of the solution. Obviously, it's always good to, pick ideas from other European countries, but what other ideas would you suggest, for other member states or that you have found are effective? And especially, I guess in light of the fact that in many places the schools were closed and are partly still closed.
I think that one of the essential things is, when thinking of where to direct finances, youth work is something the finances should not be spared there. Because whether it is digital youth work or whether it is actually going out there, because we've seen that youngsters all over the place do not just sit in front of their screens, but they gather outside as well. So they need safe adults. And I think that in the long run, societies that direct their finances towards, like Fabian was saying, NGOs or youth work, do really well, because they will reap the benefit decades from now.
I just want to add something.
Of course.
Yeah, just about NGO. I used to work with several NGO in France. I think that the big problem of NGO in France, or I don't know if in your country, is that they don't know how to touch the parents of the young people they're caring to. And this is a major problem when you want to prevent radicalization, because a lot of things young people learn is coming from their parents and from the background. So I think that the next challenging for NGO or for community activists is to bring young people with their parents to work on this.
Julianne, thank you for that point, because it's very interesting. I'd like to open that up to the other panelists. So Julianne was saying there that NGOs need to better connect with young people, because really that is the key. So Silvia Ramos, what do you make of that?
I think they could do it not only offline when they are doing their daily jobs, but also online, and getting into the social networks, making some campaigns, and trying to hear and give the space to these people, the space to speak about it, about all the issues.
I think there are two things. We have this regular youth work, like this daily youth work, and we have these specialized NGOs dealing with de-radicalization and radicalized youth. So we have to bring these together Because on the one hand, we have this regular youth work. They are in the daily life. They knew the problems of their kids and all that stuff. And we have the specialized NGOs, which have sometimes not the best way to get into that community because they have no ways to do this. So if we combine both and just mix it up, I think that's the best way, because then we have the specialized issues and also the daily life issues of their practitioners.
How important is it that the response to it is local?
To solve the problems, you need this local, you need this direct offline environment. So we need both.
But I think that we also need a kind of a pan-European approach, because I don't think the youth only identify with the people among whom they live. I think it's way more transnational than that. And so therefore, I think also role models from people who are on make videos, or people that the youth would look up to and feel similar to, need to be utilized in this.
We're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank all our panelists for their insights. Sylvia Ramos, Julien Cabanangi, Fabienne Wickman, and Annelie Portman. Thank you very much. Well, there's no doubt that during the lockdown, violent extremists and terrorists have been busy below the radar. In video game chat rooms, YouTube, and other online settings, they've found their targets: young, vulnerable people pulled into the darker recesses of the web and exposed to hateful and appalling content. Well, the full scale of what's been going on during the COVID lockdown isn't yet completely clear. But I think our discussion today indicates that the situation out there is becoming increasingly challenging. Well, thank you for joining us. This has been The View, brought to you by the Radicalisation Awareness Network. And until our next episode, goodbye for now.